They promised to restore the glory of Rome. Black-shirted soldiers marching through the streets, banners flying, crowds cheering. Benito Mussolini stood on balconies and declared that Italy would dominate the Mediterranean, that the ancient empire would rise again. The world watched, and for a moment it seemed possible. But when the shooting started, when modern war demanded more than spectacle, Italy stumbled. Tanks broke down in the desert, ships stayed in port while convoys burned. Soldiers fought bravely, but found themselves abandoned by the very system that had promised them glory. This is not a story of cowardice. This is something far more interesting, a story of a nation that believed its own propaganda, that confused theater with power, and that learned the hardest way possible that wars are won in factories and supply depots, as not on parade grounds. Over the next half hour, we're going to trace how Italy, one of the victorious powers of the First World War, arrived at the Second so unprepared. We'll see how small decisions cascaded into disasters, how strengths became weaknesses, and how a regime built on image discovered that image cannot stop bullets or fuel tanks. If you're with us for this journey, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter, and sharing them keeps history alive for everyone who needs to understand how nations rise and fall. To understand Italy's failure, you have to start with the man who shaped it, Benito Mussolini. He wanted to be Caesar, not metaphorically, but genuinely. He saw himself as the architect of a new Roman Empire, spreading across North Africa and the Mediterranean. The fascist movement he built was as much about performance as politics, rallies with tens of thousands, synchronized marching, dramatic speeches delivered from balconies overlooking packed squares. Every aspect of the regime was designed to project strength, unity, and ancient glory reborn. And it worked, at least at first. Mussolini came to power in 1922, promising order and pride to a nation that felt humiliated after the First World War. Italy had fought on the winning side, but gained little in the peace settlement. Mussolini tapped into that resentment and channeled it into nationalism. The early years focused on consolidating control and building a cult of personality. Veterans were celebrated as heroes. The military became a symbol of national rebirth, and foreign adventures in Ethiopia and Albania were marketed as proof that Italy had regained its rightful place among the great powers. But underneath the banners and beneath the rhetoric, something was wrong. The economy grew slowly. Heavy industry lagged behind Germany, Britain, and France. Investment in technology and infrastructure was inconsistent. The gap between the regime's ambitions and Italy's actual industrial capacity kept widening, but nobody wanted to admit it. This was the fundamental problem. Italy was preparing for war like it was staging a play. Everything had to look impressive. Everything had to project confidence. But wars are not won by appearances. They are won by steel production, oil reserves, and supply chains that never break. Because Mussolini's Italy built an image of power while neglecting the foundations that make power real. That contradiction would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Let's talk about numbers, because numbers tell a brutal truth. In the 1930s, Italy's economy was a fraction of Germany's and Britain's. Steel production, machine tools, fuel refining, all the heavy industries that modern war demands never reached the levels military planners needed. Italy produced tanks, but not enough. It built aircraft, but they broke down. It launched ships, but lacked the fuel to keep them at sea. The problem was not just scale, it was organization. Italy's industrial base was heavily concentrated in the north. Milan, Turin, Genoa. These cities had the factories. The South remained poor, agricultural, underdeveloped, but transportation networks were inadequate. Railroads that could have moved supplies efficiently simply did not exist in many regions. Think about what this meant on the ground. You could design a decent tank in a Milan factory, but getting spare parts, fuel, and trained crews to Libya or Greece was a logistical nightmare. Roads were poor, ports were overwhelmed, maintenance facilities were scarce. Every movement consumed resources Italy could barely afford to spend. And then there was oil. Modern mechanized war runs on petroleum. Trucks need gasoline, tanks need diesel, ships need fuel oil, aircraft need aviation fuel. Italy imported most of its oil and had almost no domestic production. When the British Royal Navy began interdicting supply convoys in the Mediterranean, Italy's war machine began to starve. And German planners understood this. They knew that the Third Reich had limited oil reserves, which is partly why Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. To seize the Caucasus oil fields, Italy faced the same problem, but lacked Germany's industrial depth and military efficiency. The result was predictable. Italian forces ran out of fuel in the middle of campaigns, leaving tanks stranded and aircraft grounded. But perhaps the most damaging gap was not material. It was doctrinal. Italy's military thinkers had not kept pace with modern warfare. The army was trained for static positional fighting, reminiscent of World War I, not the fast-paced armored maneuvers that Germany had perfected. Officers were promoted for political loyalty as much as competence. Their planning was often driven by what would look good politically, rather than what would work militarily. When doctrine is confused, everything suffers. Should you concentrate your armor or spread it out? Should you prioritize fuel conservation or aggressive attacks? Should you coordinate closely with air power or rely on infantry? Italian commanders too often made decisions that satisfied political masters in Rome, but made no tactical sense on the battlefield. This was the reality. Italy arrived at World War II with ambitions that required a Germany-level industrial base, but with an economy and military culture that could not support those ambitions. The gap was not small, it was enormous, and it was about to become catastrophic. North Africa should have been Italy's natural theatre. Libya was an Italian colony. The geography seemed manageable. The British were far from home, operating out of Egypt. On paper, Italy had advantages. But modern war does not care about paper advantages. It cares about supply lines, fuel depots, spare parts, and the ability to sustain operations over weeks and months. The British, despite being technically further from home, had shorter and more secure supply lines. Convoys could move through the Suez Canal. Port facilities in Egypt were well developed. The Royal Navy controlled the Mediterranean's eastern approaches. Most importantly, British logistics were organized, professional, and relentless. Italy's supply situation was a disaster. Convoys from Italy to Libya had to cross hundreds of miles of open sea, constantly threatened by British submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders. Even when supplies arrived, the infrastructure in Libya was inadequate. There were not enough trucks. Roads were primitive. Fuel depended on tankers that the British hunted aggressively. Italian soldiers fought in conditions that would test anyone. The desert is merciless. Temperatures swing from scorching days to freezing nights. Sandstorms blind and choke. Supplies of water, food, and ammunition become matters of life and death. When those supplies failed to arrive, soldiers suffered and died, and they did fail, repeatedly. Italian tanks ran out of fuel mid-campaign. Artillery units exhausted their ammunition. Troops went hungry. Medical supplies dwindled. The British counterattacked in December 1940, and Italian defences collapsed like a house of cards. Tens of thousands of Italian soldiers were captured, not because they refused to fight, but because their logistical system had abandoned them. Then, Germany intervened. Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps arrived in early 1941. Rommel was aggressive, brilliant at mobile warfare, and capable of dramatic successes. For a while, the situation stabilized. German equipment and German logistics reinvigorated the front. But this rescue came at a cost. Italy lost strategic independence. Italian forces became auxiliaries to German strategy. Decisions were made in Berlin, not Rome. The prestige Mussolini craved evaporated as it became clear that Italy could not sustain a major campaign without German support. And even with German help, the fundamental problems remained. The Axis could not control the sea. British intelligence, including the famous Ultra program that decoded German communications, gave the Allies critical advantages. British air power and naval forces interdicted supply convoys with devastating efficiency. By 1942, Rommel himself was complaining that he could not sustain operations because fuel and ammunition were not arriving. North Africa became a graveyard for Italian ambitions. The regime had promised victories that would prove Italy's rebirth. Instead, it delivered humiliation and dependence. In October 1940, Mussolini made one of his worst decisions. He ordered the invasion of Greece. On the surface, it seemed straightforward. Greece was smaller, less industrialized, and appeared vulnerable. Mussolini wanted a quick victory to match Hitler's conquests in Poland and France. He wanted to prove that Italy could act independently, that it did not need to follow Germany's lead in every theater. But wars are not won by wishful thinking. The Italian invasion was poorly planned, inadequately supplied, and launched at the worst possible time. Autumn rains turned roads to mud. Mountain passes became treacherous. Greek defenders, fighting for their homeland, proved far more determined and capable than Italian planners expected. The Greek army counterattacked and pushed Italian forces back into Albania. It was a stunning reversal. Italian units, already suffering from poor logistics and low morale, found themselves retreating through mountainous terrain in winter conditions. Soldiers froze. Supplies failed to arrive. Officers issued contradictory orders. This was not a failure of courage. Italian soldiers fought, often desperately, but courage cannot compensate for bad planning, inadequate equipment, and a command structure that prioritized political optics over military reality. Mussolini's pride was shattered. The invasion that was supposed to demonstrate Italy's power instead revealed its weaknesses to the world. Worse, it forced Germany to intervene. In April 1941, Hitler launched his own Balkans campaign, crushing both Greece and Yugoslavia. Germany's intervention stabilized the front, but at a price. Once again, Italy was revealed as the junior partner, incapable of achieving its goals without German help. The regime that had promised to restore Roman glory was reduced to following in Germany's shadow. The Greek campaign also had strategic consequences beyond immediate military failure. It delayed Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, forcing Hitler to divert forces to the Balkans. Some historians argue that this delay, costing precious weeks of summer campaigning, contributed to Germany's failure to capture Moscow before winter. Italy's miscalculations in Greece rippled across the entire war. Let's talk about Italy's navy, because here the contradictions become almost poetic. The Regia Marina had beautiful ships. Battleships like the Vittorio Veneto and Roma were impressive by any standard. Fast, well-armed, products of excellent engineering. Italian cruisers were sleek and powerful. On paper, Italy had the third largest navy in the world. But naval power is not about having impressive ships. It is about using them effectively. And Italy's navy, for all its elegance, was hamstrung by fuel shortages, poor doctrine, and a cautious command culture that feared losing prestige assets. The British Royal Navy understood Mediterranean warfare. It was not about grand fleet battles like Jutland. It was about controlling sea lanes, protecting convoys, and denying the enemy supplies. The British focused on what mattered: logistics, intelligence, and coordinated air-sea operations. Italy, by contrast, planned for decisive fleet engagements that never materialized. Its admirals hesitated to risk major ships, fearing the political consequences of losses. Fuel shortages meant that even when ships could sail, they could not operate at full capacity. Training suffered. Coordination with air forces was poor. The British had radar. Italian ships largely did not, especially early in the war. It is that technological gap meant British forces could detect and engage Italian ships before Italian lookouts even saw them. British signals intelligence, breaking Italian naval codes, gave the Royal Navy advance warning of Italian movements. One of the most dramatic examples came at the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941. British forces, using radar and intelligence intercepts, ambushed an Italian fleet at night. 3 Italian cruisers were sunk, and over 2,000 sailors died. The Italian Navy never fully recovered from the psychological blow. But the deeper problem was operational. Italy's navy could not protect the convoys that supplied North Africa. British submarines, aircraft, and surface raiders hunted Italian supply ships relentlessly. Fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements destined for Libya ended up at the bottom of the Mediterranean. A navy that cannot protect its own supply lines is not fulfilling its strategic purpose, no matter how beautiful its ships are. Italy's Regia Marina became a fleet in being, impressive when viewed in harbor, but unable to change the course of the war. Behind all these statistics and strategic failures are human beings, soldiers who believed their government's promises, men who fought in impossible conditions, families who received letters that stopped coming. Italian soldiers were not cowards. That myth needs to be destroyed. Many fought with courage and determination, but courage alone cannot overcome systemic failure. Imagine being an Italian infantryman in Libya. You wake up in a desert camp, your uniform is worn, your boots are falling apart. Its breakfast is inadequate. Your officers promise that supplies are coming, but they have been promising that for weeks. Your rifle works, but ammunition is rationed. The truck that should transport your unit broke down, and there are no spare parts. Then the order comes to attack. You advance across open desert under enemy fire. British positions are well supplied, well defended. You take casualties. You reach your objective exhausted, only to learn that the fuel for your supporting tanks never arrived. Artillery support is limited because shells are scarce. By evening, a British counterattack forces you to retreat. You are not retreating because you lack courage. You are retreating because the system that sent you into battle failed to give you the tools to win. Morale in many Italian units was fragile. When soldiers see authority devoted to spectacle instead of necessities, trust erodes. When officers are promoted for political loyalty rather than competence, soldiers notice. When promises are repeatedly broken, cynicism spreads. There were units that fought tenaciously. The Ariete Division in North Africa earned respect even from British opponents. The Folgore Parachute Division defended positions in Egypt with extraordinary determination. Individual acts of bravery were common, but bravery cannot fix logistics. It cannot manufacture fuel or ammunition. It cannot replace broken equipment. And when the system fails repeatedly, even brave soldiers reach their limits. The human cost extended beyond battlefields. Italian civilians suffered as the war ground on. Allied bombing raids targeted industrial centers. Food shortages became severe. The regime's promises of glory rang hollow as cities burned and families mourned. By 1943, exhaustion had set in. The public that had cheered Mussolini's speeches now questioned everything. Soldiers at the front felt abandoned. Officers privately admitted that the war was unwinnable. The gap between propaganda and reality had become impossible to ignore. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was the beginning of the end. Italian and German forces defended the island, but the outcome was never in doubt. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. Allied logistics were relentless. Italian units, demoralized and poorly supplied, surrendered in large numbers. By mid-August, Sicily was in Allied hands. The invasion shattered what remained of Mussolini's political support. The Fascist Grand Council, the very body that had supported his regime, turned against him. On July 25, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III ordered Mussolini's arrest. The dictator who had ruled Italy for 21 years was removed from power. The new Italian government, led by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, began secret negotiations with the Allies. On September 8th, Italy announced an armistice. The war for Italy was over, except it was not. Germany had anticipated Italian betrayal and prepared for it. German forces moved swiftly to occupy northern and central Italy. Italian units, many of which had not been informed of the armistice in advance, were disarmed or forced to fight their former allies. Chaos reigned. Mussolini, rescued by German commandos, was installed as head of a puppet state in northern Italy called the Italian Social Republic. But this regime had no real authority. It was a German occupation with an Italian face. Italy split into zones. The south aligned with the Allies. The north remained under German control. And everywhere, ordinary Italians tried to survive. But out of this collapse came resistance. Partisan groups formed in the mountains and cities. These fighters, often communists, socialists, or simply patriots who refused foreign occupation, waged guerrilla war against German forces and Italian fascist collaborators. The partisans were brave, resourceful, and crucial to the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. They sabotaged supply lines, gathered intelligence, and tied down German forces that might have been used elsewhere. Yes, their contribution is a reminder that even when central institutions fail, local courage and determination can still matter. The war in Italy continued until May 1945, when German forces finally surrendered. By then, Italy had been a battlefield for nearly 2 years. Cities were destroyed. Infrastructure was ruined. Hundreds of thousands had died. The fascist dream of restored empire had become a nightmare of occupation and civil conflict. So what do we take from Italy's experience in World War II? First, ambition without foundation is dangerous. Mussolini wanted empire, glory, and respect, but he built his regime on spectacle instead of substance. Parades cannot win wars. Speeches cannot fuel tanks. Image cannot replace industrial capacity. Second, modern war is fundamentally industrial. It is won in factories, shipyards, and oil refineries. It is won by supply chains that function under pressure and by logistics that never fail. Italy lacked these foundations and paid the price. Third, leadership matters. Mussolini's choices, his prioritization of political theater over patient preparation shaped everything that followed. Leaders set the tempo and direction. When they choose glory over competence, nations suffer. But fourth, and perhaps most important, this is not a story of national inferiority. Italian engineers designed impressive machines. Italian soldiers fought bravely. Italian partisans resisted occupation courageously. The failure was structural and political, not inherent to the people. Italy's experience is a cautionary tale about the gap between rhetoric and reality. Then it is a reminder that sustained capacity wins over short-lived spectacle, that preparation beats performance, and that wars are won by those who do the hard, unglamorous work of building and maintaining the systems that make victory possible. If you appreciate these historical deep dives and want more stories that explore the human and strategic dimensions of the past, please subscribe. These stories matter, and sharing them keeps history alive and relevant. The empire that could not hold together offers lessons that echo across time. Ambition is vital. It drives nations forward. But ambition without the industrial base, the logistical depth, and the honest assessment of capabilities becomes hollow. Theater cannot replace steel. Propaganda cannot substitute for fuel. And in the end, reality imposes itself. Yea, no matter how impressive the uniforms or how dramatic the speeches. That is Italy's story in World War II. Not a tale of cowardice, but of mismatch. Not a story of failure alone, but of what happens when a nation confuses its aspirations with its actual power. Thank you for watching. Remember these lessons. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep history alive.